the summer of 1381, England stood on the edge of chaos. The world as the people knew it was unravelling, torn apart by a great unrest, the likes of which had not been seen for centuries. Peasants, craftsmen, and common folk, tired of the crushing weight of taxes and an unrelenting monarchy, rose up with one voice, determined to challenge the status quo. It was not just about rebellion, but about hope. Hope for change, hope for equality, hope for a future that didn't see them as mere cogs in the wheel of a system designed to benefit the few. This was the Peasants' Revolt of 1381, a moment in history where the oppressed finally dared to strike back. Welcome to ASMR History. In today's video, I'll be delving into a tumultuous chapter of English history, one that shook the very foundations of medieval society. The Peasants' Revolt was not just a clash of swords and pikes, but a clash of ideas about power, class, and the rights of the common man. With soothing whispers, I'll guide you through this extraordinary tale of rebellion. Sit back, relax, and let the history of 1381 unfold before you. The Peasants' Revolt was sparked by a cocktail of deep grievances: the harsh poll tax imposed by the government, the aftermath of the Black Death, and years of war had left the lower classes suffocating under unbearable burdens. They rallied behind leaders like the charismatic Wat Tyler, the radical preacher John Ball, and the young king Richard II, who would soon find himself at the heart of this historic storm. As John Ball famously questioned in his fiery sermons, when Adam delved and Eve span, who then was the gentleman? This simple yet profound statement captured the essence of the peasants' anger, challenging the rigid social hierarchies that had long kept them at the bottom. In this video, we'll explore the causes of the revolt, the events that defined it, and the consequences that rippled through history long after the dust had settled. From the fiery speeches that stirred the hearts of the oppressed, to the brutal confrontations in the streets, we will uncover the legacy of this uprising. What began as a local rebellion would go on to become a symbol of resistance, echoing down through the centuries. But before we dive into the revolt itself, we must first understand the world these peasants inhabited. Life in late 14th century England was marked by hardship and change. To truly grasp the magnitude of what was to come, we need to set the stage and take a closer look at England during this pivotal time. England in the late 14th century was a land of contrasts, where the mighty castles of lords and nobles stood tall above the villages of peasants, the two worlds intertwined by the ancient feudal system. This system was the backbone of medieval society, a rigid hierarchy that dictated every aspect of life. At the top were the king, his noblemen, and the clergy, those who owned the land and controlled wealth. At the bottom, toiling endlessly, were the peasants. Bound to the land they worked, they had little control over their fate. They owed their lord labour and a portion of their crops, while they received protection and a small plot of land in return. For had held firm, seemingly unshakable. But by the late 1300s, the ground beneath it was beginning to crack. Life for the peasants, who made up the vast majority of the population, was a constant struggle. They worked long hours in the fields, lived in small, cramped homes, and were subjected to heavy taxes and strict laws that governed nearly every part of their existence. The feudal system, while offering some security, left little room for personal freedom or upward mobility. A peasant's life was one of subsistence, always at the mercy of the elements, disease, or the demands of the local lord. It was a hard life, but for generations it had been accepted as the way things were. Then came the Black Death. This horrific plague swept through Europe in the mid-14th century, claiming the lives of millions. England was no exception, and by the time the epidemic had passed, nearly half of the population had perished. Historian R.B. Dobson put it best when he said, "The Black Death was not just a plague of death, it was also a plague upon the existing social order. The old world was shattered. The sudden and drastic decline in the population left a gaping hole in the labour force. Fields lay untended, and lords found themselves struggling to maintain their lands without enough peasants to work them. For the surviving peasants, this presented a rare opportunity. With so few labourers, their work became more valuable. For the first time in memory, they had the leverage to demand higher wages and better conditions. Some peasants were even able to leave the land they had been tied to for generations, seeking work in towns or other estates. The rigid boundaries of the feudal system were beginning to blur, and the once untouchable nobility was being forced to negotiate with those they had always considered beneath them. But as quickly as the pendulum had swung in favour of the peasants, it was yanked back by the ruling class. The government, alarmed by the newfound demands of the lower classes, passed a series of laws to freeze wages at pre-plague levels and prevent peasants from moving freely. These laws only added to the growing discontent. By the time the 1370s rolled around, tensions between the peasants and the ruling elite were simmering just beneath the surface, ready to boil over. Then came the poll taxes. Desperate to fund costly wars in France, King Richard II's government introduced a new tax that would push the already strained peasantry to its breaking point. The poll tax was simple and brutal. Every person, man or woman, rich or poor, was required to pay a flat rate of 1 shilling. It was a heavy burden for the peasants, who already struggled to make ends meet. As the taxes increased year after year, resentment turned to anger. The poll tax was not just an economic strain, it was seen as deeply unfair. While the rich could afford the shilling without a second thought, for the poor it could mean the difference between feeding their families and going hungry. The proclamation of the poll tax spelled out the law clearly. Every person, male or female, shall pay the sum of 1 shilling. It did not differentiate between the wealth of the taxpayer. It did not care whether you owned land or begged for bread. For the peasants, who had already endured so much hardship, this was a final insult a symbol of the oppression they had endured for generations. Religion, too, played a critical role in shaping the mindset of the people. In a deeply pious society, the teachings of the church could be a powerful tool for either maintaining or challenging the status quo. Figures like John Ball, a radical preacher with a fiery tongue, used the pulpit to speak directly to the peasants' growing frustration. Ball was not like other priests who spoke only of divine authority and submission. He preached of equality and justice, using the Bible to call into question the very foundation of feudal society. In one of his most famous sermons, Ball declared, "Things cannot go well in England, nor ever will, until all things be in common." His message was simple, yet radical. The world was not meant to be divided between lords and peasants, the rich and the poor. Ball's words, grounded in both scripture and social justice, resonated deeply with the oppressed, further fueling the flames of rebellion. To many peasants, his sermons offered not only religious comfort, but also a justification for their growing belief that they deserved better, that their suffering was not part of God's plan, but a product of human greed. By the spring of 1381, all the pieces were in place for an explosion of anger. The economic hardships caused by the poll taxes, the labour shortages after the Black Death, and the fiery rhetoric of men like John Ball had created a perfect storm. What had been simmering for years would soon erupt into open rebellion. From the fields and villages of England, the common folk would rise up to challenge the lords, the king, and the system that had oppressed them for so long. With tensions at their breaking point, the spark would come in May of that year, setting off a chain reaction that would see peasants marching on London, determined to make their voices heard. In May of 1381, the countryside of England was like a tinderbox waiting for a spark, and that spark came from the counties of Essex and Kent. The poll tax collectors arrived, demanding payment from peasants who could no longer bear the burden, and the response was swift. Outraged by the injustice, a small band of men in Essex attacked the collectors, refusing to pay the oppressive levy. Word spread like wildfire, reaching villages across the southeast. In Kent, the rebellion quickly gathered momentum. Within days, it was no longer just a few angry villagers defying authority. An entire movement had been born. It wasn't just the tax itself that infuriated the people. It was what the tax symbolised. For too long, the common folk had been trampled underfoot, their voices unheard and their burdens increasing. The rebels knew that if they did nothing, their lives would continue to be defined by poverty and oppression. As they marched, their numbers swelled. Peasants, craftsmen, even some lower-ranking clergy joined the cause. They had a mission now, to bring their grievances directly to the king, to make him understand their suffering, and to force those who had exploited them for generations to listen. Their first major act of defiance was to burn the tax records. These documents, the very symbol of their oppression, went up in flames destroyed legal archives and burned the homes of unpopular officials. The air was thick with smoke and the intoxicating sense of rebellion. With every step they took us toward London, they grew more emboldened. No longer were they just farmers and labourers. They were an army, marching with a righteous fury. The cry that echoed through the rebel ranks was clear, for men will never be free unless the Lords be brought low. At the forefront of this growing movement stood two men who would become the symbols of the Peasants' Revolt. The first was Wat Tyler, a man whose name would soon strike fear into the hearts of England's nobility. Tyler was no aristocrat or man of wealth. He was a humble craftsman, a tiler by trade, who understood the hardships of the common people, because they were his hardships too. It was said that Tyler rose to leadership after striking down a tax collector who had insulted his daughter, though the truth of this tale has faded with time. What is certain is that Tyler became the voice of the voiceless, leading with a fierce determination to see justice done. As the contemporary chronicler Froissart described him, Wat Tyler, a bold man and leader of men, gave voice to the grievances of the poor. Alongside Tyler was John Bull, a radical preacher whose words had stirred the hearts of the common people long before the rebellion broke out. Bull was no ordinary priest. His sermons did not dwell on obedience or the divine right of kings. Instead, he preached equality and fairness, planting seeds of revolt in the minds of those who listened. Things cannot go well in England, he had once proclaimed, nor ever will, until all things be in common. Paul believed that the feudal system was not only unjust, but also contrary to the teachings of Christ. In his eyes, the revolt was not just a political uprising. It was a moral and spiritual duty. It was said that when Paul spoke, the people felt as though they were hearing the voice of God, calling them to rise up against their oppressors. As the rebels moved closer to London, their numbers grew into the tens of thousands. This was no longer a local uprising, but a full-blown rebellion, with men and women from across the southeast of England marching together. The capital was their destination, and there they hoped to confront King Richard II himself, to demand an end to the poll taxes, to call for justice, and to see their grievances addressed. But this was not a peaceful petition. The rebels were angry, and they intended to be heard by any means necessary. Their arrival in London would shake the city to its core. The streets of the capital were not prepared for what was coming. As the rebels marched through the gates of London in June 1381, they carried with them the fury of a people pushed to the brink. Once inside, they set to work, targeting the symbols of their oppression. They stormed the Savoy Palace, the grand residence of John of Gaunt, the king's powerful uncle, and set it ablaze. They destroyed the prison at Fleet, releasing those held within. They even ransacked the offices of the royal treasury, destroying tax documents and anything that tied them to the heavy-handed rule of the nobility. The city was in chaos, and the once untouchable ruling class was now under direct threat. But burning records and storming buildings were only part of the rebellion. The rebels had demands that they believed could reshape the very fabric of English society. They wanted an end to the oppressive taxes, the release of prisoners, and the dismissal of corrupt officials who had exploited them for so long. More than that, they wanted freedom. They demanded the abolition of serfdom and the feudal obligations that had kept them chained to their lord's land. It was a vision of a new England, one where men and women could live free from the yoke of aristocratic tyranny. But first, they had to be heard. The rebels sought an audience with King Richard II, a boy of just 14, who now found himself in the centre of this storm. Richard, from the safety of the Tower of London, knew that he could not ignore the rising tide. The rebels were at his doorstep, and their demands were too loud to dismiss. But this meeting, which promised so much hope for the common people, would soon take a dark turn as the rebellion reached its climax. Before we explore the siege of London and the tense negotiations between the rebels and the king, let's take a closer look at how the rebels' demands began to crystallise, and how their moment of triumph was teetering on the edge of disaster. The rebels marched on London with an energy that could not be contained, like a wave building strength as it moves towards shore. They surged forward, their ranks swelling with every step. Men, women, and children, all bound by a shared sense of injustice, pressed toward the city, carrying with them the hopes and fury of the common people. As they reached London Bridge, the gates to the capital stood wide open, whether from fear or a desire to avoid bloodshed, no one knew for certain. But it didn't matter. The people of London, many of whom sympathised with the cause, let the rebels pour into the city without resistance. Once inside the walls, chaos reigned. The rebels, inflamed by years of oppression and emboldened by their numbers, went straight to the heart of their grievances. They sacked government buildings, destroying tax records and seizing anything that represented their exploitation. But it was the grand estates of the wealthy that bore the brunt of their fury. The Savoy Palace, the luxurious residence of John of Gaunt, was reduced to a smouldering ruin, its riches burned or cast into the Thames. In the eyes of the rebels, this was not wanton destruction, it was justice, as one proclamation echoed through the city streets: "We shall be all one, and let there be no more lords." The call for equality, for the end of the feudal order, rang loud and clear. The violence wasn't confined to property alone. Royal officials, tax collectors, and those seen as traitors to the common people were hunted down and executed. The rebels acted with a swift and brutal hand, believing that only through such actions could they cleanse England of its corruption. To them, the bloodshed was not just vengeance, it was a reckoning. Amid this whirlwind of destruction, young King Richard II, only 14 years old, found himself thrust into a situation far beyond his years. From his sanctuary in the Tower of London, Richard watched as his capital burned and his subjects turned against him. Yet, despite his youth, the king understood that he had to face the rebels if there was any hope of saving his reign. He sent word that he was willing to meet with the leaders to hear their grievances and discuss a path forward. The first meeting took place at Mile End on June 14th, 1381. As Richard rode out to face the throng of rebels, the weight of the kingdom seemed to press on his shoulders. The young monarch knew that the eyes of the nation were upon him. Thousands of angry peasants surrounded him, and among them their charismatic leader, Wat Tyler. It was a tense encounter, with the future of England hanging in the balance. But Richard, perhaps surprisingly, handled the moment with poise. "You shall have no captain but me," he declared, offering himself as the one who could deliver their demands. It was a bold statement, a promise that he alone could bring the changes they sought. At Mile End, the rebels laid out their demands. They called for the complete abolition of serfdom, the reduction of oppressive taxes, and the removal of corrupt officials who had profited off their misery. They wanted nothing less than a transformation of the social order, a New England where men were no longer bound to the land or subject to the whims of the nobility. A letter to the king summed up their desires. "We seek the freedom of all men and the just treatment of the poor." These were not minor reforms. They were asking for a revolution. Richard, whether out of fear or a desire to buy time, agreed to many of their demands. He promised to end serfdom and to grant pardons to the rebels, offering them a sense of hope that their grievances would finally be addressed. With these assurances, many of the rebels began to disperse, believing that they had won. But the most radical among them, including Wat Tyler, remained unconvinced. They sought more than promises. They wanted concrete action. The following day, on June 15th, another meeting was arranged at Smithfield, a large open area just outside the city walls. Here, Tyler and the rebels would confront the king one last time, determined to see their demands fulfilled. The meeting at Smithfield was fraught with tension from the start. As Richard approached with his retinue, Tyler stepped forward to present his final demands. What exactly was said during this exchange remains unclear, but it was enough to escalate the situation rapidly. Accounts differ on the details, but the outcome is well known. As tempers flared, Tyler was struck down by the king's men, either in an act of treachery or a response to a perceived threat. With their leader dead, the rebels' unity began to crumble. Despite the shock and confusion that followed, Richard showed unexpected resolve. He rode directly into the crowd of rebels, placing himself at the mercy of the very people who had marched on his city. It was a bold and dangerous move, but with Tyler gone, the rebels were leaderless and uncertain. The king seized the moment. He spoke to them directly, urging them to return home and promising again that their grievances would be addressed. Remarkably, his words were enough to pacify the crowd, who began to disperse in the belief that their cause had not Tyler's death marked a turning point in the revolt, one that would see the movement unravel as the crown moved to crush any remaining resistance. Before we examine the death of Wat Tyler and the brutal suppression of the rebellion, we must first understand how the hope of reform, so briefly kindled, was extinguished in the days that followed. The fate of the Peasants' Revolt was sealed in a single fateful moment at Smithfield. It was June 15th, 1381, and Wat Tyler, the bold leader of the rebellion, stood face to face with 14-year-old King Richard II. Tyler, confident in the righteousness of his cause, laid out his final demands. He called for more than just the end of serfdom. He sought true equality. Tyler wanted an England where no man could be another's master, where the lords were stripped of their power and the common people could live freely and fairly. But this moment of triumph would be his last. As Tyler spoke, the tension in the air was palpable. Accounts differ on exactly what triggered the violence, but the outcome was swift and brutal. Tyler's boldness, perhaps his refusal to bow before the king, ignited fury among Richard's men. One of the king's loyal knights, William Walworth, stepped forward and struck Tyler down. The leader of the revolt, who had carried the hopes of tens of thousands, was mortally wounded. As he collapsed, the future of the rebellion crumbled with him. Chronicler Thomas Walsingham captured the gravity of the moment. In an instant, the leader was cut down, and the rebellion began to die with him. Panic rippled through the crowd of rebels. Their leader had been felled, and for a brief moment, chaos threatened to erupt. The peasants, who had marched on London with hope and fury, now faced the terrifying reality that their uprising might collapse. But in this tense and dangerous moment, it was Richard who stepped forward. The young king, remarkably calm in the face of the mob, rode out alone into the throng. It was an act of boldness or perhaps desperation, but it worked. "I am your king," he called out, his voice cutting through the clamour. "You shall have no captain but me." With Wat Tyler dead, the rebels found themselves at a crossroads. Many were unsure what to do next, but the sight of the king, just a boy, speaking directly to them, calmed their fury. Richard promised once again that their demands would be met, that he would personally see to the reforms they sought. Tired and shaken by the day's events, many of the rebels accepted the king's word. They began to disperse, believing that their cause had not been in vain. But those promises, like so many others, were nothing more than words. As the rebels retreated, Richard's true intentions came into focus. The king, who had spoken so smoothly to the crowd, had no intention of following through on his pledges. Once the threat had passed, the crown turned its attention to vengeance. Richard's attitude towards the peasants hardened, and his words, once filled with the promise of reform, became dark and menacing. "Rustics you have been, and rustics you are. You will remain in bondage, not as before, but incomparably harsher," he declared, revealing the cold truth that lay beneath his earlier diplomacy. The suppression of the revolt was swift and ruthless. With Tyler dead and the rebel forces scattered, the nobility seized the opportunity to reassert control. Across the southeast of England, those who had taken part in the uprising were hunted down. Royal forces and local lords took their revenge with brutal efficiency. Hundreds of rebels were captured, and executions became a grim daily occurrence. Gallows were erected in town squares, and the bodies of the condemned were left hanging as a stark reminder to all who might dare to rise against their betters. The leaders of the revolt, aside from Wat Tyler, were among the first to face the king's wrath. John Bull, the radical preacher whose sermons had fueled the rebellion, was captured and brought to trial. His defiance did not waver, even as he stood before his judges. He was convicted of treason, and in July 1381 he was hanged, drawn and quartered, his body torn apart as a public spectacle. It was a brutal end to a man who had inspired so many with his dream of a more equal world. The common folk, who had dared to dream of a better life, now found themselves facing an even harsher reality. The promises of freedom, of an end to serfdom, had been replaced by the sharp edge of the sword. The rebellion, which had started with such hope and energy, was now crushed beneath the iron heel of the aristocracy. Richard's earlier agreements were revoked, and the heavy hand of the law came down on the peasantry with a force that was both punitive and symbolic. The message was clear. Rebellion would not be tolerated, and those who challenged the established order would pay with their lives. But even as the revolt was brutally suppressed, its echoes could not be so easily silenced. Though the immediate gains of the rebellion were erased, the ideas that had driven it could not be killed by the sword. Wat Tyler and John Bull may have been dead, but their vision of a more just and equal society lingered in the minds of the people. The revolt of 1381, despite its failure, had shown the common folk that they could rise up, that they could challenge the seemingly unbreakable chains of feudalism. Though the rebellion had been crushed, it left behind a legacy of defiance that would simmer beneath the surface of English society for generations. As we turn now to the aftermath and consequences of the revolt, we must ask, what lasting impact did this uprising have on the future of England? The peasants had been defeated, but had their rebellion planted the seeds of change? In the immediate aftermath of the Peasants' Revolt, the Kingdom of England trembled under the weight of its own violence. The rebellion, once so full of promise and passion, had been shattered, and its remnants were swiftly hunted down. Across the southeast, the king's men moved relentlessly to crush any flicker of resistance. What had started as a cry for justice was now silenced by the cold efficiency of royal retribution. Those who had dared to rise up were brought to justice, though, for many, justice was little more than a death sentence. The executions were swift and brutal. Gallows dotted the landscape, their grim silhouettes casting long shadows over the fields. Rebel leaders were rounded up, put on trial, mercy. The king's message was clear. Defiance would not be tolerated. This New England, the one the peasants had briefly imagined, would not come to pass. Instead, the old order reasserted itself with a vengeance. John Ball, whose fiery sermons had lit the spark of rebellion, was one of the first to meet his end. His death was as violent as his ideas had been radical. Hanged, drawn, and quartered, his remains scattered as a warning to any who might think to follow in his footsteps. Wat Tyler's assassination at Smithfield had signalled the end of the revolt, but in truth, the movement had begun to unravel the moment the first heads rolled. Local lords, emboldened by the Crown's ruthless suppression, took the opportunity to reclaim their authority with force. Across the country, anyone suspected of having ties to the revolt was swiftly dealt with. For the rebels who had fought for a fairer world, there was no escape. As historian Rodney Hilton remarked, rebellion was swiftly punished, but the ideas could not be so easily erased. Indeed, while the revolt had failed in its immediate aims, its impact would be felt long after the bloodshed had ceased. The peasants may have been defeated, but their cries for freedom had been heard. In the years that followed, the ruling class would work hard to forget the uprising, but the common people could not forget what they had experienced. They had risen up once, and even in failure, they had proved that the unbreakable chains of feudalism could, in fact, be shaken. The long-term consequences of the Peasants' Revolt stretched beyond the gallows and the shattered dreams of those who had fought for change. In the short term, the Crown imposed stricter laws to prevent any future uprisings. Serfdom, the system that had bound peasants to the land for generations, was reaffirmed, and the king and his nobles took great pains to ensure that no such rebellion could happen again. The poll taxes were quietly abandoned, but little else changed in the immediate aftermath. However, beneath the surface, the revolt had planted the seeds of something much larger, a shift in the social and political landscape of England. For centuries, the feudal system had been the foundation of medieval society. Peasants owed their labour to their lords, and in return they received protection and land to work. It was a system as old as the land itself, but the revolt of 1381 showed that this system, once thought to be unshakable, was beginning to crack. The Black Death had already weakened the feudal structure by decimating the population and creating labour shortages. Now, the revolt had made it clear that the peasants would not remain docile forever. Although the rebellion was crushed, it marked the beginning of a slow but steady erosion of the feudal system. In the decades that followed, more and more peasants found ways to buy their freedom from servitude. Landlords, facing the economic realities of labour shortages, began to offer better terms to workers. The harsh laws imposed in the wake of the revolt were difficult to enforce, and over time, the grip of feudalism began to loosen. Historian Christopher Dyer captures this sentiment perfectly. The Peasants' Revolt marked the beginning of the end system that had governed their lives could be challenged. The old social contract between lord and peasant was beginning to unravel, and as it did, it opened the door for a new era in English society. In the political sphere, the revolt left a lasting mark as well. While the nobles and the crown managed to hold on to power in the short term, the rebellion shook the very foundation of medieval governance. The peasants had called not just for economic relief, but for political representation. They demanded a say in how they were governed, and though their demands were not met in 1381, their call for reform would echo through the centuries. The seeds of future movements, such as the English Civil War and the rise of parliamentary power, can be traced back in part to the demands made by the rebels during the Peasants' Revolt. Even as the immediate effects of the uprising faded, its long-term influence continued to shape the course of English history. It was not just a rebellion, it was a moment of awakening for the common people. They had tasted the possibility of a different world, one in which they were not bound by the chains of feudalism, one in which they could determine their own fate. That vision, though crushed in 1381, would inspire future generations to continue the fight for justice and equality. As we move into the final chapter of this story, we will explore the legacy of the Peasants' Revolt, how this brief but powerful uprising influenced future generations and helped to shape the course of English history. The Peasants' Revolt of 1381, though crushed in the fields and streets of England, did not die with Wat Tyler or John Bull. Instead, it lived on, becoming a powerful symbol for future generations who would fight against oppression and inequality. For centuries to come, the revolt was invoked by those who sought to challenge the status quo, a reminder that the common people could rise up even if the forces arrayed against them seemed insurmountable. It was a spark that, though briefly extinguished, lit the way for future rebellions, revolutions, and movements for justice. The legacy of the Peasants' Revolt stretched far beyond the bloodied streets of London. In the centuries that followed, it served as a rallying cry for other movements. From the English Civil War in the 17th century to the Chartist movement of the 19th century, the spirit of 1381 was ever present. The Chartists, who fought for political reform and the extension of voting rights to the working class, saw themselves as the heirs to the struggle begun by Tyler and Bull. They understood that while the peasants had not achieved their immediate goals, their rebellion had laid the groundwork for future challenges to feudal and autocratic rule. Marxist historian Eric Hobsbawm, reflecting on the broader significance of the revolt, wrote, "The Peasants' Revolt of 1381 was a seminal moment in the history of class struggle. For Hobsbawm and others, the revolt was more than just a medieval footnote. It was an early expression of the ongoing battle between the oppressed and the ruling classes, a battle that would continue through the ages. The revolt, though seemingly a failure in its immediate objectives, became part of a much larger story, the long and difficult journey towards social justice. But the legacy of the Peasants' Revolt was not confined to political movements. It also left an indelible mark on the cultural imagination. For centuries, poets, writers, and artists have looked to the revolt as a source of inspiration. In literature, the uprising was immortalised in works like William Morris's A Dream of John Bull, a novella that blends history and fantasy to explore the continuing relevance of the revolt's ideals. Morris, a passionate advocate for socialism in the 19th century, used the story of the rebellion to reflect on the timeless nature of the struggle for equality. In one particularly poignant passage, Morris wrote, "Men fight and lose the battle, and the thing that they fought for comes about in spite of their defeat." Morris's words capture the essence of the revolt's legacy. Even though the peasants were defeated, the ideas they fought for, justice, freedom, and equality, endured. The battle was lost, but the principles survived, slowly seeping into the consciousness of future generations. It is this idea that makes the Peasants' Revolt so compelling. The notion that even in failure there is victory, that the ideals of a movement can outlive the lives of its participants. In addition to literature, the revolt has also been depicted in various forms of art. Paintings, sculptures, and modern reinterpretations have all sought to capture the defiance and hope that fueled the uprising. One particularly striking image is the depiction of Wat Tyler confronting King Richard II at Smithfield, a moment frozen in time that encapsulates the sheer audacity of the revolt. Such cultural representations help keep the memory of the Peasants' Revolt alive, reminding us of its significance long after the historical events themselves have faded into the past. In modern popular culture, the Peasants' Revolt has appeared in film, television, and even music. Its themes of rebellion and class struggle resonate as strongly today as they did in 1381. Whether in documentaries or fictionalized retellings, the story of the revolt continues to captivate audiences. In many ways, the Peasants' Revolt has transcended its medieval origins, becoming a universal symbol of the fight against oppression. A story that can be adapted to any time or place. But the true legacy of the Peasants' Revolt lies not just in its cultural depictions or its influence on political movements. Its lasting impact is in the way it helped to shift the course of English history. While the revolt did not immediately dismantle the feudal system, it began to erode the foundations upon which that system was built. It showed that the common people, though bound by centuries of tradition, could challenge their masters. It planted the seeds for the eventual abolition of serfdom, the rise of a more mobile and independent labour force, and the gradual shift toward a more modern economy. As we reflect on the legacy of the Peasants' Revolt, it becomes clear that this was more than just a failed rebellion. It was a critical moment in the ongoing fight for justice and equality, a moment that demonstrated the power of the people to stand up to their oppressors, even in the face of overwhelming odds. freedom from tyranny, equality before the law, and the right to a fair share of the fruits of one's labour are as relevant today as they were in 1381. With the memory of the Peasants Revolt firmly etched into the annals of history, it serves as a powerful reminder of the resilience of the human spirit. No matter how many times a just cause may seem defeated, it can rise again in new forms, in new places, with new voices. As we move toward the conclusion of this story, we will reflect on how the Peasants' Revolt serves as a symbol for the timeless pursuit of justice, and how its lessons continue to resonate in the world we live in today. The Peasants' Revolt of 1381 remains one of the most fascinating and pivotal moments in history for me. It's a story of everyday people, farmers, labourers and craftsmen, rising up in defiance of a system that had kept them oppressed for centuries. Though they were defeated, their courage and bold demands for justice left a lasting mark on the course of English society. It wasn't just about taxes or labour, but about the fundamental struggle for dignity, equality, and the right to be heard. They may not have achieved their goals in their lifetimes, but the echoes of their fight for fairness continue to resonate through the ages. The themes of class struggle, rebellion, and the relentless pursuit of justice are woven into the fabric of this revolt. For me, it serves as a powerful reminder that even when a cause seems lost, its spirit can live on, inspiring others to continue the fight for a better world. As historian Michael Postan said, the revolt may have failed in its immediate goals, but its echoes reverberate through history. That's the beauty of history. It never truly ends. It just evolves. Thank you so much for joining me today on this journey through one of the most remarkable uprisings in history. If you enjoyed this story and would like to hear more, be sure to subscribe to ASMR History for more relaxing explorations of the